Hey everyone, it's Tyler with the Museum of the American Revolution. We're back with one of our conversations, and I'm really excited today to meet with our friend Kalela Williams. Kalela is a friend of the museum, and I would love, Kalela, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how you got involved in living history.
Sure, sure, absolutely. So, again, my name's Kalela Williams, and I do public programming at the Free Library of Philadelphia. My title is Director of Neighborhood Library Engagement Programs. So, I do programs in the humanities as well as civic engagement. And so, of course, history is an interest of mine from my work at the Free Library, but also just it's always been an interest of mine. And I began working with the Museum of the American Revolution. In part, we talked about library partnerships, but I also talked about possibly doing living history, and of course, Tyler was completely on board and completely encouraging. Just a little bit more about myself. I have a social media site, Black History Maven, and that is Black history news and information and policy and culture pretty much every day, especially right now. But it's also connecting the past to the present. That's an interest of mine that I've always grown up with and always had. So yeah.
I thought it was really interesting looking at your different sites and your different work, how many different facets of public history and intellectual engagement you're involved in professionally and for fun. And I mean, one of the things we've talked about before is that at the museum, we meet a lot of kids who are just encountering these things for the first time, and they're really excited to get dressed up, and maybe they go on and they become a reenactor or a museum professional. But you came to that part of this world a little later. So what was that like?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking about that. I came to this. I started doing any living history. My first living history experience was, I think I was 37, and it was actually with Old Sturbridge Museum. They had a program where you could stay overnight, you could wear, they would outfit you, and you also had to learn a skill, and you also cooked dinner. So I went to that, and I was dressed in 1830s gear, and I absolutely loved it. I got to milk a cow. I got to feed cattle. It was fantastic. And it was just something that, and I ate the best food. I mean, some of the best food of my entire life. It was amazing. Like being cooked in a fire. Well, I wasn't cooked in the fireplace. The food was cooked in a fireplace. It was so good. So I just knew that I had to do it again. And so that's, this past fall in October 2019, I was part of Occupied Philadelphia, and the museum very kindly gave me an entire outfit to wear. They completely fitted me up with everything from shoes to stockings to all those little things that you don't even think about, and that I had no idea were a part of being in a different century. And it was just something that at that time I was 40, and it was something that it's walking into someone else's footsteps, and it's touching history from an entirely different angle in an entirely different way, and it's just wonderful. And it's sometimes painful because you're in it, but the experience itself is incredible.
I think that's an amazing way to put it. The sense that we get in trying to cultivate empathy and imagining what life was like, that it can be so valuable to eat the food, to sleep on the corn husk mattress, to walk around Philadelphia wearing a gown or stays. And I was thinking, you're also an incredible writer of fiction and nonfiction. So were those sorts of skills of imagination and what you've learned about research and writing, have they been applicable to building we talk about building an impression sometimes, this assemblage of clothing and the way you hold your body, and sometimes even the way you speak that evokes a certain period or a certain person. Was there a way that you found to kind of bring those skills to this new work?
Yes, absolutely. There are, so I write short stories, and I also am working on a longer work that is taking place. Part of it is taking place in the 1700s. And when you write fiction, you are writing from the perspective of another person, and you have to get inside that person's head. You've got to get inside that person's head, and you have to think everything from what would they wear, what would they think of this, and it can almost be obsessive because you're always thinking about when you're really deep in writing, you're always seeing your world through the eyes of another person. And so, in the sense of building an impression, you're also building another human being with their own thoughts, their own desires, their own goals, their own tragedies that they've experienced, and their own ways of moving forward. And it's a gift, and it's really something that they're two things that really complement each other, because as I'm building this impression, I am trying to embody another human being just as I do in my writing. And so it's really the same kind of skill. It's that same empathy that you mentioned, where you're really getting inside somebody else's head.
Do you think, is there something particularly valuable about that empathy when you're approaching stories that have voids? You know, I think one of the things we really want to talk about is a woman named Helena Harris. And before we get to her, I was just wondering if, you know, your skills as someone who thinks a lot about fiction might actually give you tools that, you know, I might not have as someone who's really used to working just with hard data and facts. Has that been something that's been thought-provoking?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think that it's more than, when you're building another person, it's more than just dates. It's more than just facts. It's more than just the statistics of that particular era that you're looking at. It is those things, of course. Our where we are in time informs everything, right? But it's also looking at the emotional side of a person. It's looking at a person through that lens of humanity, and really understanding who we are. And that's actually just a quick note too. I was never much into history in high school, because I learned history through the lens of dates and treaties and wars and this and that, which is fine. Like, hey, I love the Revolutionary War now. But I'll tell you why, because I didn't learn about the humanity of it. I never learned what people ate and how it affected what people ate, and how it affected what people did, and how it affected their jobs, and if they had jobs, and how it brought people into these different communities. It brought different people. You had an influx of people coming in and people leaving, and I never learned the human story of history. And so that's why I was never interested when I was learning it in school, because we didn't have these comprehensive museums like the Museum of the American Revolution. We didn't have these at that time. And so now this is why I think museums are so important, and why historical programs, why public programming is so important. I mean, I'm obviously biased because I do that for a living, but because that it puts you there and it teaches you history from the inside out as opposed to the outside in.
I think that's exactly how I like to think about it. You know, some of my favorite objects in the museum, for example, are not the most famous things. They didn't necessarily belong to people you've heard of, but they're like the toys that children played with, and something that someone dropped and lost by accident. And I think that's really, like, for me, if anyone thinks about me in 250 years, it's because they might have accidentally found something that I wrote or left behind. I don't think it's going to be because of some profound accomplishment. So yeah, it's exciting to kind of bring back those stories. I worked with an archaeologist once who he said that archaeologists are in the business of saving lives, because they look at people, you know, enslaved people, people of color, servants, women who were largely invisible in the period, and they kind of pluck them out of obscurity and back to life, which I always thought was really evocative. And now that I've kind of led this trail of breadcrumbs to a person named Helena Harris, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about her and what we know about her, and then maybe about what has gone into your efforts to pluck her out of documentary records and kind of two dimensions and bring her to life in the flesh.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about Helena. So Helena Harris is someone who I ran across in a 1794 directory. In the back of the directory, it mentioned, I'm just going to look at my notes here, there is also a school for Blacks supported by the Abolition Society in Cherry Street, kept by Helena Harris, a Black woman of considerable parts who had been for several years employed as a teacher of white children in England. That's all I have. That's really all I have. I've looked for Helena. I haven't, by the time I started looking for her, it was right around the time of quarantine, so I wasn't able to, I haven't been able to really hands-on dig into some records as I'd wanted to, but for right now, that's all I have of her. What I did do was I looked at who else was named Harris in that directory. So obviously she wasn't mentioned. Mostly heads of household were mentioned in those directories at the time, and those were mostly men. And so then I tried looking up the men's who had the last names of Harris. Most of them seem to be, based on what these directories generally don't tell you the race of a person, but most of the individuals who I looked up, just finding information about them, they seem to be white. I don't think that Helena would have been married to a white person at the time. So I don't think that these are, and obviously Harris is a very common last name. So then the question is, then you have to go and you have to look at what else can you find about when you can't find information about a person. And this is what we see a lot when we look at African-American history, that people, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, there's very little exact record of a human being left behind when we look at African-American history. So then you look at the world around. So I think, okay, there's a few clues that I have. She's associated with Quakers in some way or form. Now, whether she is a Quaker or not, I don't know. She obviously is educated and she has spent time in England. So then my thoughts are, what could have possibly brought her into these realms? One question that I have is, was she associated with Quaker settlements in the Caribbean? And I say that because there was a lot of British to Caribbean trade happening in human beings as well as in sugar, the products they produce. So a lot of that was happening in the 17th century. But is it possible that Helena was part of that? Was the descendant possibly of one of those people who was either enslaved in the Caribbean or who possibly somehow managed to obtain their freedom. So these are some questions that I have. There's a question of how she became educated. Now, we know, of course, that Philadelphia, there was a school for African Americans as early as 1750. And the one thing I don't know about Helena is how old she is. I haven't been able to find out in 1794 how old she was. But considering that she's of considerable parts, one can assume that she's maybe over the age of 30. One can assume that she's probably not young necessarily in order to sort of earn this accolade. So there's a lot of building and looking at who this person could have been and trying to fill in what you don't know with what you do know. And at the end of the day, I'm never going to know a lot about Helena, but I can fill in and I can imagine, just the same as you do when you write a fictional character, you're filling in what you don't know with what you do know. And so I think that's really the work that I'm doing.
You know, I was thinking about what Philadelphia must have been like in 1794, and many Americans recently have experienced firsthand what it's like to be in the midst of an epidemic, a pandemic. Do we know anything about what Helena's experience of the yellow fever might have been, or is that something we also need to triangulate from other sources?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That is definitely an element of triangulation. We don't know. I suspect that Helena lived around, Fourth and Market, maybe Third and Market, maybe that sort of area. And I only say that because that James Forten was another prominent African American man who's living, or another prominent African American person. He and his family were living in that area, and there were others. There were other African Americans living in that vicinity. Alice Van Dyne was another person who was probably living within that vicinity. There was Christ Church and St. Paul's Church. So there was sort of this nexus of places that were strongholds within African Americans who were free and some who were enslaved. So it's possible, considering that she taught on Cherry Street, that she lived in that community. Now, of course, 1794, on the heels of the yellow fever epidemic, And the yellow fever epidemic was, it reached its peak in 1793. It was horrendous. I think about 5,000 people in Philadelphia died. And there would be carts that rattled past your house that where a caller would call out, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead." Just an incredibly horrible time. People who could afford to leave left. They left the city, and those who could not afford to leave had to stay behind. And the African American community was put in a really interesting place because that Benjamin Rush, a physician, what I would call a progressive person for the time, called on two African American leaders, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who were both ministers. He asked if they would encourage their congregations to provide help to the community, to serve as nurses. And of course they did. Benjamin Rush thought that African Americans were immune to yellow fever. It turns out we were not. And it's possible to me, I think Richard Allen and Absalom Jones might have known this, but they might have thought, this is a way we can ingratiate ourselves in the community, and this is a way we can be trusted, because things were not great for African American folks at that time. So, I mean, of course. The problem is, of course, that the community actually turned on the Black community. The white community actually turned on the Black community. They said, this is your fault. When you served as nurses, you spread yellow fever. And they said, all these immigrants from Haiti, all these, obviously this is on the heels of the Haitian Revolution as well. There's so much turmoil happening. And so you have white families fleeing to Philadelphia, bringing enslaved people. And so there was blame cast there. So I can imagine this obviously could not have failed to impact Helena's life. It could not have failed to touch her in some way. Maybe she was a nurse. Maybe she was one of the people who went into homes. Maybe she suffered from yellow fever herself and survived. She might have lost Ken. We really don't know. But it's something that we can relate to now, because that we're seeing the impact of COVID-19 and how it affects communities differently, and how it's in one way it's a disease that cuts across and that can affect us all, but in another way it's affecting the people who, when we think about the people who can afford to stay home, and I'm one of those people. I'm like one of the people during the yellow fever epidemic who could afford to leave. So when we think about people who can afford to stay home versus people who have to go out, who have to, who cannot work from home and who have to make a living, or those who've lost their incomes, we can think about the ways in which this connects with history, and the ways in which we're in some ways experiencing what other people did.
I think that's so incredibly evocative, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about. When having worked at the museum and worked in Old City, Philadelphia, the 1793 yellow fever epidemic is sort of like a kind of basic story that's a familiar part of local history, but it was not something that I had revisited in like an experiential way, or definitely not thought about the social ramifications of disease. And I'm just looking at all those sources and with such a new light, which is really interesting. I think you're right. They can offer a lot of material for people today who are considering all of those dimensions of this experience. I was wondering, now that you've done maybe the hard work or maybe the easy work of kind of recapturing a world and a feeling and a sort of someone's interior life. I understand you might have brought a few props about how you do that in an exterior way. And, we had hoped to have you at the museum this summer. We're really excited to have you back in the future so people can meet you. But could you show us a couple of the components of Helena Harris's, of your wardrobe, Amy?
Yes, I can. This is fun. So one of the things that I've been doing, and I'm sort of reaching into a bin here, which is why I'm sort of leaning a little bit, but I came into this knowing nothing about what people wore. I have been educated very well by you. You have been an incredible resource, and some other staff at the museum. And I've also been really privileged to know other people who are involved with this. Chanie McKnight, I met with her and of Not Your Mama's History, and just when she was in Philadelphia at one point, I just reached out to her and said, I have to meet you. I have to talk to you. I'm fangirling a little bit. And Nastasia Parker, who of course will be, she's another person who's done a lot of work for the museum, and I understand is continuing to do some work this summer. Jana Violante, which I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, but I met her at Occupied. She was she gave me so much help. I was just like, how do you string the, because of course, you're using pens. I'm used to buttons and everything's penned on. So the first thing, obviously I had to get some stays. And so that was like that was a whole process of just learning how to be in stays, like learning shoes first, then corset, which is actually the name of another historical interpreter. That's a handle that she goes by. There is obviously we've got, I love this color. This is a petticoat, and it's made of linen. It's sort of a sage color. Got the little pleats here, and it ties on. There's a lot of strings. That's the other thing that I was really surprised about. You have so many strings on your corset, on your stays. You have so many strings on your petticoat. Just strings everywhere. And this is, I'm going to stand up. Oops. Oh, it's here. I just got this. This is a dress that Jana created. It is gorgeous. You can't really see it. It sort of looks black. It's so dark of a green that it almost looks black. It's called Charleston green is the name of the color. But there's a lot that goes into this. There's the hand stitching. This is, of course, completely hand sewn, as is the petticoat. And the petticoat, by the way, was made by Nastasia Parker. So I had different people sort of help me out with creating this wardrobe. And last but not least, I have my lovely cap. Where's my head? And obviously I'm just sort of setting it on top of my hair right now. But that was made by Kristen Hammerstrom, who also you all have worked with. So I've kind of just, and the stays, of course, are red threaded. So, oh, and shoes. So of course, these are all in plastic, but I've got, because I've never worn them because I expected to wear them this summer. But of course I've got these shoes from Fugawi. So this is all, it's a process of ask, of course I ask you so many questions like, Tyler, what about this? Tyler, what do you think about that? Tyler. So, because I really know nothing. And even with putting on the dress, I'm going to need help with, I'm going to sort of, it's going to be interesting pinning that on by myself because, it can be tricky. And I remember with just doing doing Occupied Philadelphia, it's so tricky just working with these pens, and I probably crushed like a million pens. I probably bent so many of them. But it's been really exciting. And there's still a few things that I'm missing. I mean, I'm missing a neckerchief. I'm missing stockings. I need to get garters. I need ribbons for my shoes. My shoes tie up with ribbons. So many little details that are involved with getting dressed at that time. But it's such a rewarding process and an incredible process to do these things.
Yeah, I'm so excited you've dropped some of the names of some of our favorite people. We've interviewed Jana and Kirsten. Nastasia is going to be doing a performance on Juneteenth, on June 19th. We're filming this on June 18th, but folks will probably have seen that performance before they see our interview. So lots of opportunities to connect with these amazing people. And it makes me think a lot about kind of, I think, how all those people, how you and I share this sense that all of that hand sewing, going to these different makers then produces something that does make you feel closer to the past, right? Than if you just sort of got something from a costume shop for one night. You can really feel like this is what the fabric felt like, and these are the stitches, and here's where it constrains my movement, which is really, I think, when I get suited up in historical clothing, that's one of the most interesting things. I was wondering, I wanted to ask kind of two bigger questions at the close of our conversation. The first is, when I get dressed up, I look like a white male Revolutionary War soldier. It definitely impacts the sort of conversations I have and people's perception about what I'm going to be talking about. I wonder, what are the challenges and conversely, the potentials maybe of doing this work as an African-American woman?
That's a really good question. Because So when I, with Occupied Philadelphia, for instance, I'm obviously in the body of an African American woman. I can't change that, and I don't want to. Turns out, but it's. I think that it either can invite people in a different way, or it can make people uncomfortable because we don't like to talk about enslavement. We don't like to talk about Black history in terms of its troubled aspects in many cases. And so I did feel that sometimes it made people a little uncomfortable because I can't, obviously I can address myself as a person and say, at that time I was portraying someone named Alice Van Dyne, who was the mother-in-law of James Wharton, who I mentioned earlier. But I can say who I am, but when we're talking about the revolution, we're talking about choices that people had to make, and that many African Americans had to make as informed through a different lens. Because of course, freedom meant something very different to African Americans, whether they were free themselves or whether they weren't. Because in most cases, it seems like free African Americans at that time had family who were enslaved, or had kin who were enslaved. They had community who were enslaved. So there was never just your freedom. It was a holistic way of experiencing the world. And so I think that again, it can either be a way that people can say, wow, this is a chance for me to talk about slavery. This is a chance for me to talk about slavery and freedom during that time, or I don't want to talk about it and I'm afraid to engage. But either way, it's a good way to again, I'm glad to be in this body because I'm glad to be able to organically introduce these conversations.
And I think on behalf of the museum, one of the things that's most exciting about having Joel Cook, who's an African American interpreter at the museum, or Daniel C., who's an Asian American, is that most people assume, I think, that like everyone in the Revolutionary War looked like me. But in fact, like if anyone in Philadelphia today had walked around Philadelphia in the 1770s, they would have seen people who looked like them. And that can be a really hard thing to do if you're just reading the books or if you're just looking at the paintings, right? But if you can bring that diverse, complicated, difficult world to life in living history programs, I think it really does have this potential to give people a whole new kind of visual vocabulary and dictionary to what the revolution might have looked like at the time. So that's been really exciting. We're filming this on June 18th, 2020, and in addition to a global pandemic, we've also had an enormous and important series of social events in the last couple of weeks. Racially driven violence and killings, demonstrations, resulting social actions, the destruction of statues. And given all of those swirling events and the things that are to come, I just guess I wanted to end by asking you if those very recent events have changed any of your thinking about the stories we've been talking about the 18th century. And maybe the broadest way to ask this question is why does this history matter right now?
That is another very good question. I don't know that recent events have changed my perception of history, but I think it's underscored why history is so important and what it can tell us. And also it can serve as a comfort in the way that the revolution was not pretty. It was not clean. It was not necessarily glorious. In fact, I would argue it was not glorious at all for the people who were on the ground. There were food shortages, there was death, there was bombing in the streets of buildings, there was destruction, there was it was incredibly a violent time, and it was in the name of something that people believed in. And also we can argue economic interests, et cetera, but it was a rebellion, and it was, and so I think that we sometimes, when we look at wartime in history, we sometimes look at it through this noble lens, and this lens of everything was made for a Gilbert Stuart painting. And the fact is that it was not. To be on the ground during that time was incredibly uncomfortable. But it had to be. It had to be in order for things to change. And so I think that what we're seeing now is we're seeing that need for where small isolated protests have only gotten so far. And so this worldwide multiracial protest is something that really speaks again to, when you think about the revolution, you think about people of different races on different sides and who are fighting for the same cause, but who are different races. That, of course, the American Revolution, that was an integrated war. And so, when you think about now, it really talks to us, and it tells us, it tells us that this has happened before, and it reminds us that this is not always clean and perfect. And I think that some other thoughts are that when we look at statues and we look at monuments, and I can completely understand folks' feelings about monuments coming down, in the sense of I can understand the grief that could cause for some people. But I also have to really remind folks sometimes, certainly people in my own life, that enslavement and people who perpetuated slavery, it wasn't just, oh, this is just something that happened. Enslavement was a system that was underpinned by violence, and it was enforced by violence and the threat of violence. It was enforced by the threat of sale, of losing your family members. It was incredibly violent institution, and it doesn't mean that we can't admire people who we've always admired, but it does mean that these people are always complex. That people are complex creatures. And history is best served complex. That's just a sort of way that I cling to looking at history. That we can understand human beings as human beings, and we can also understand that the way that we've elevated people perhaps isn't a way that we need right now. We don't need to necessarily put people on pedestals. We can look at them as human beings and understand every single facet of them, and that's far more interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's incredible. That's incredible. Like, this person was like me. They had faults and problems and issues and things they needed to work on. And they also did great things. So we can look at history through this prismatic lens, as opposed to looking at it as a one-dimensional object.
Kalela, I think that is so well put, and such a wonderful way to end what has been a really exciting, fascinating conversation. In case people want to follow up with you, ask questions, keep an eye on the many different facets of their work, could you tell us the best places to maybe chase you down online?
Yeah, absolutely. So I, of course, I work at the Free Library of Philadelphia, so you can always look me up there. But you can also look me up at KalelaWilliams.com, or you can just Google Black History Maven, and you'll find me. You'll find me on Facebook, and you'll find me on my website. So, yeah.
Well, Kalela Williams, thank you again for joining us here at the Museum of the American Revolution, and we look forward to seeing you back in Philadelphia soon.
Thank you.